The breach charge blew, and Ilara was already through the smoke before it could settle. 3 mercenaries held the doorway. She took the first in the throat, pivoted hard on her back heel, and put 2 rounds through the second's visor without slowing her forward step. The third raised his weapon. She was already under it, 1 elbow into the join of his arm. His gun hand dropped. Her knee finished the conversation. It wasn't a firefight. It was choreography written in ballistics. Behind her, the breach team stacked at the threshold. None of them had fired. Major Zahn lowered his weapon slowly, staring at the space where Ilara Vance had just passed through a kill zone like it was a doorway she'd used before. His mandibles twitched once, then stopped. He had no category for what he had just watched. What was she before they sent her here? Stay close. I wish I could tell you the Spire saw it coming. It didn't. 6 weeks earlier, the Vanguard Spire smelled of ozone and sterilized metal, and the faint mineral bite of iron-filtered recycled air. It was a brutalist fortress punched into orbital space above Kethai's IV, all hard angles and reinforced ceramic, a proving ground for the finest military cadets in 7 star systems. The corridors were built wide to accommodate Drakari shoulder plates and Oculan sensor arrays. The ceilings were built high because several species could not tolerate enclosure. Nobody had built anything with a human in mind. Ilara Vance entered the main assembly hall carrying a standard-issue canvas pack that looked like it had survived several atmospheres in the wrong direction. She was the only unarmored body in the room. She stood a full head shorter than the shortest cadet in the nearest row, and 2 full heads shorter than the Drakari in the back, whose plated shoulders alone were broader than she was tall. Several cadets turned to look at her. 1 Oculan, multi-lensed eyes cycling through rapid focus shifts, actually stepped back half a pace as though recalculating a distance it had misjudged. Ilara adjusted her pack strap and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling had stress fractures in the ceramic panels, 3 of them running from the ventilation column toward the east load-bearing rib. She counted them the way people count things when they want to know how a structure would come apart. The Oculan noticed her looking up. It said nothing. Proctor Kalok stood at the front of the hall on a raised platform. He was tall even by Drakari standards, iridescent cobalt scales catching the overhead light in shifting patterns, segmented optical ridges that tracked each cadet automatically, a ceremonial disruption baton clipped at his side that he had never needed to actually use on a student. He held a data slate in one hand and read from it without looking up. Integration cohort, 31 cadets, 7 species. You are here because your species sent you. He set the slate down. Some of you were sent because your species believes you are exceptional. Some of you were sent because your species believes this spire will make you exceptional. The spire does not care which you are. The spire will determine that for itself. His optical ridges swept the room. They passed over Ilara the way a sensor passes over something that registers a low reading. Twice. The labyrinth grid begins in 4 hours, he said. You will be assigned a partner from outside your own species. You will locate and disable 3 hunter-kill sentinels. You will not be graded on speed. You will be graded on whether you survive. He clicked off the platform lights. Cadets began to disperse. The small Oculan with the rapid-focusing eyes ended up beside Ilara without clearly intending to. It stood about 1.5 meters tall, with 6 eyes arranged in a 2/4 pattern, each lens independently mobile. Its limbs were thin enough that its joints showed like knuckles through fabric. It held its data tablet against its torso with both hands. You are the Sol 3 unit, it said. It was not a question. Ilara, she said. Reese, the Oculan said. It ran a quick scan on her, then it ran it again. Your biometric baseline is significantly below threat threshold. The Sentinels prioritize high cardiovascular output, high muscular density, high ambient thermal signature. It looked at her. Your readings are low across all 3 categories. I know, Ilara said. Reese's lenses cycled rapidly. I was going to say that may be an advantage, but I then calculated that if you are incapacitated, I have a 73% chance of being dismantled by the first sentinel we encounter, and an 89% chance of dismantlement by the second. So I am hoping you are more capable than you appear. Ilara rolled her neck. The vertebrae cracked, a dry, sequential pop that moved from her shoulder joint upward, loud enough that Reese flinched and took half a step back. I usually am, she said. The labyrinth grid was exactly what it sounded like. Shifting metallic corridors arranged in an 8x8 configuration, walls that repositioned on a randomized 12-minute cycle, the whole thing filled with synthetic fog that smelled like burnt copper. Visibility was roughly 4 meters. The hunter-kill sentinels moved on magnetic rail systems built into the ceiling, silent, fast, guided entirely by sensor arrays that tracked biological signatures. Thermal, audio, biometric pulse. Reese had mapped the first 2 corridors in approximately 90 seconds and was currently sketching a probable third based on the magnetic interference patterns he could detect through his secondary lenses. Ilara was watching the ceiling. The sensor array on the sentinels, she said quietly, is it multispectrum or primary dominant? Primary audio with thermal secondary, Reese said, not looking up from his tablet. Why? Ilara didn't answer. She was doing something with her breathing, slowing it. Reese didn't notice at first because he was focused on the corridor geometry, but when he glanced over, he noticed that her chest had stopped moving in any visible rhythm. Her exhales had become so shallow they were invisible. What are you? He began. The sentinel came around the corner. It was roughly the size of a transport crate, all articulated metal and sensor arrays, weapons mounted at 4 points on a rotating torso. Its primary emitter swept the corridor in a cone of pale blue light. The cone passed over Ilara. It kept moving. Reese did not breathe. The Sentinel's audio array rotated. It was triangulating. It had 2 signatures, his own biometric output, which was unfortunately quite high because he was currently experiencing what Sol 3 literature would call terror and nothing else. 1 signature, 1 target. The weapon array began to orient. Ilara was already above it. She had moved to the wall while his attention was on the sensor cone. She had climbed the corridor struts in complete silence, moving along the upper frame with the flat-handed grip of something that had learned, at a cellular level, that staying off the ground was staying alive. She hung at the join of the ceiling track where the Sentinel's own rail system ran and dropped onto its dorsal housing in one controlled movement. Her hands found the primary articulation coil, the bundle of servo cabling at the neck join between the sensor housing and the weapon torso, and pulled. The Sentinel dropped. Not fell, dropped. No power spike, no alarm sequence, no secondary warning. It simply stopped having structural continuity and folded onto the floor in pieces. Ilara landed beside it. She looked at Reese. 3 seconds, she said. Did you count? Reese's lenses were doing the thing where they all focused independently on different parts of her at once. Your pulse. It vanished from my biometric scan. I was watching the readout and it was there and then it was not. You were standing in front of me and your pulse was not registering. You were a ghost in the machine, she said. She brushed a piece of the Sentinel's housing off her sleeve. Sol 3 predators used to run prey until the prey's organs gave out. We had to be very quiet to do it. The silence became biological. Are you ready for the second one? Reese looked at the dismantled Sentinel. He looked at her. Yes, he said, in a voice that did not fully believe this was happening, but had decided to proceed anyway. Proctor Kalok was watching the labyrinth's feed from the observation platform when Ilara's biometric signature disappeared. He ran the diagnostic twice. The board was clean, no malfunction, no sensor error. The Oculan cadet showed a clear signal, elevated heart rate, heightened cortisol analog, the readable biochemistry of a creature under stress. The human signal was simply absent, not low, not distorted. Gone. Kalok's optical ridges contracted. He pulled up the visual feed instead, since the biometric was clearly malfunctioning, and watched the human cadet drop from the ceiling onto a hunter-kill Sentinel and dismantle it with her bare hands, in the time it took him to confirm the visual was live. He stood very still. His aide, a young Oculan named Thesis, was watching the same feed. She made no sound. "Run the biometric calibration again," Kalok said. "It's already run, sir." "Run it again." Thesis ran it again. The human had a pulse. It was calm, slower than it should have been by any biological metric for a creature that had just dropped from a ceiling and torn apart a combat drone. It was closer to the readout of a creature that was asleep. "Her cardiovascular output is—" "I can see what it is," Kalok said. He set the diagnostic tablet down on the console. He picked it back up. He was doing this without entirely noticing he was doing it, which was unusual for him. They found the second sentinel 12 minutes into the trial. Ilara used the same method. Rees counted 2.5 seconds this time, which he considered important data. He had also begun counting his own heartbeat, which was not useful data, but was something to do with the biological anxiety currently running a steady 140 beats per minute through his primary vascular system. "The third one is going to be in Corridor 7, Ilara said, consulting Rees's mapping tablet. She had picked it up from his hands without asking. He had not objected. "Based on what?" Rees asked. "The repositioning cycle. The walls moved 11 minutes ago. If the Sentinels are on randomized patrol routes, they will have reoriented along the new geometry. Corridor 7 has the longest uninterrupted sightline after a reconfiguration. High-threat sensor platforms favor long sightlines." She handed the tablet back. "It's where I would be." Rees looked at the tablet. He looked at her. "How do you know where a hunter-kill Sentinel would want to be?" "I think about where I'd want to be," she said, "and then I think about what I'd be hunting, and then I go there." They found the third Sentinel in Corridor 7. It was down in 90 seconds. The trial results posted before most of the cohort had left the debrief chamber. Ilara and Rees were listed at the top, with a note in the system that simply read, 3 Sentinel neutralizations, 0 biometric alerts, no damage to grid infrastructure. The note below it, added by Kalok's own authorization, read, "Anomalous biometric behavior during trial, under review." Rees read this over Ilara's shoulder. "He is going to put you in the ring," Rees said. Ilara looked at the note. Then she looked at the combat schedule posted beneath it. Her name had already been added to tomorrow's unarmed assessment roster. Opposite Scarv. Scarv was the largest Drakari cadet in the cohort. He massed probably 8 times what Ilara did. His plated hide had a natural armor rating that required purpose-built breaching weapons to penetrate. He was, by every measurable metric that Kalok trusted, the most physically formidable cadet in the Vanguard Spire. He had also, in Ilara's first hour at the Spire, been the only cadet who had introduced himself to her by name. She read his name on the roster. "Yes," she said, "he is." Scarv found her in the equipment corridor the morning of the fight. He was enormous up close, not in the way that large things are sometimes larger than expected, but in the way that makes a space feel smaller the moment something enters it. His dorsal plates were a deep amber brown, each one slightly overlapping the next, and they moved when he breathed in a slow, tide-like shift. He held his hands open at his sides, which Ilara had already learned was the Drakari gesture for "I am not beginning anything." "I wanted to speak before the assessment," he said. His voice was low and careful, the way large creatures sometimes speak when they have learned that their volume startles smaller ones. "I will not use full compression force. I will pin, not crush. You have my word." Ilara was relacing her left boot. She finished the knot before she looked up. "That's kind of you," she said. "It is practical," Scarv said. "I have no interest in damaging an ally species before we have established whether you are useful. And Kalok," he paused. "Kalok wants to make a point. I would rather not be the instrument of it." Ilara stood. She was approximately the height of his shoulder joint. He looked down at her with the patient expression of a creature that had never, in its life, needed to look up at anything. "Scarv," she said, "when we get in the ring, fight me properly." He blinked his secondary eyelids. I could injure you. You could try, she said, not aggressive, not a boast, just a plain statement of how she expected events to go, the way you might tell someone a route through a city you know well. Scarv looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen a Drakari do yet. He laughed, a low, resonant sound that moved through his chest plates like a struck bell. You are either the bravest creature I have encountered, or you know something I do not. Both, Ilara said, and walked past him toward the training hall. The combat ring at the Vanguard Spire was built into the Spire's lower assessment deck, a circular floor of impact-dampening composite surrounded by a transparent barrier on 3 sides, open on the 4th for the Proctor's station. The barrier existed primarily to protect observers from Drakari combat spray and the occasional structural consequence of 2 armored cadets making contact at full force. It had never been installed, with the expectation of a species that had no armor. The cohort filled the observation rail quickly. Word had moved through the spire the way it always does when something is expected to be educational, which is to say, everyone came because they expected to see something resolved. The Drakari cadets stood at the back rail, their combined mass making the deck register a faint tremor on the impact sensors. The Oculan cadets stood near the front, their lenses already focused, already recording. Rees stood at the far left of the observation line. He was holding his tablet against his chest with both hands and not looking at it. Kalok stood at the Proctor station, hands clasped behind his back. He had the expression of someone who had arranged something and was waiting for it to arrive. Scarv entered the ring from the east gate. The Drakari cadets at the back clicked their plates together twice, approval. He rolled his neck, settled his shoulders, and turned to face the west gate. Ilara walked in. She was not wearing anything different. The same standard-issue cadet uniform, the same worn boots. She had tied her hair back. She stood in the center of the ring and looked at Scarv the way she had looked at the ceiling stress fractures in the assembly hall, cataloging, measuring, deciding. Kalok raised his baton. Standard assessment rules, no weapons, contact permitted, trial ends on incapacitation or tap out. He looked at Ilara. Cadet Vance, you may begin when ready. He had addressed her last. This was not standard protocol. Rees noticed it. Scarv moved first, a wide, sweeping approach, deliberately slow, angling to wrap rather than strike. He was being careful. He was giving her a chance to find a position. It was, genuinely, an act of consideration. Ilara moved sideways. Not back, not away. Sideways and slightly in, closing the distance rather than opening it, and Scarv's sweep passed over empty space where she had been. She was already at his right flank. He adjusted, fluid, fast, much faster than something that size had any business moving, and pivoted to face her. She moved again, the same direction, the same slight closing angle. Scarv was tracking her with his primary optical array. He was also, Rees could see from the biometric overlay on his tablet, adjusting his balance estimations in real time. He had expected her to retreat. She kept not retreating, and each time she failed to retreat, she ended up approximately half a meter closer to him and slightly further around his right side. She was walking in a spiral. It took Rees 4 seconds to recognize the geometry. He did not say anything because he could not, at this moment, produce sound. On the 5th pass, Scarv committed. He brought both arms in for the pin, not aggressive, not cruel, exactly what he had promised, a controlled restraint designed to end this cleanly, and Ilara dropped. Not fell, dropped, deliberately, the moment his arms committed to the arc, sliding beneath his guard in the fraction of a second before the angle closed. She hit the floor flat, rolled once, and came up on his far side. In the same motion, she caught his dorsal right ankle plate with both hands, found the gap in the articulation joint that her spiral walk had told her was there, and pulled. Scarv lurched. His balance compensation fired, but the lurch had already happened, and she was already moving up his back, finding handholds in the plate gaps with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone climbing something they have climbed before. By the time his hands came back to find her, she was between his shoulder blades, her legs wrapped around the juncture of his neck plates and his primary dorsal vascular cluster, the soft channel that ran just below the surface between plates 3 and 4. She didn't squeeze, she didn't need to, she just held the position. Scarv reached for her, his arms couldn't reach his own back at that angle. He tried to roll, she adjusted. He tried to drop to the floor, she shifted her weight and held. The ring was absolutely silent. Scarv's arms slowed. His oxygen was restricting, not cut off, but compressed, the vascular channel doing exactly what vascular channels do when something applies steady, sustained pressure to them. He tried once more to reach behind him. Then his right hand came down and hit the floor twice, flat-palmed. Tap out. Ilara released him and stepped back. She was breathing at the same rate she'd been breathing when she walked in. Scarv got up slowly, turned and looked at her. His expression had shifted, not anger, something that might have been, in a Drakari, the closest equivalent to awe, a recalibration of category. "You knew," he said, "you knew where the joint was before we started." "I watched you walk," she said. "Everyone has a gap." The ring was still silent. Kalok had not moved from the Proctor station. His optical ridges had contracted to their narrowest position, which on a Drakari Proctor was the expression that happened when the model of the world that had been running inside your head stopped matching what your eyes were showing you. He had scheduled this match to demonstrate a principle. The principle he had demonstrated was not the one he had intended. His scales along the lateral ridge of his jaw had gone from iridescent cobalt to a flat, pale gray. It happened when their pigment cells stopped receiving the autonomic signal that maintained coloration, the biological equivalent of a system losing power to a non-essential function because something more urgent had priority. Rees had a readout on his tablet, the Proctor's own biometric output, visible through the Spire's assessment monitoring, had spiked. Dread, clean, species general, no ambiguity dread. It was not that the human had won. Rees understood that. It was that Kalok had looked at her after she stepped back from Scarv, breathing steady, posture unchanged, the complete absence of any physiological sign that she had just been in a fight, and understood, for the first time, that she had not been in a fight. She had been doing something else entirely, something that used the fight as a medium the way a tool uses a surface. Sol 3 predators survived by running prey until their organs failed, the xenobiological briefing had noted, a detail Kalok had skimmed when Terran cadets were first integrated into the program. He had read it the way you read something that doesn't require action, a fact about a distant species, interesting, irrelevant. He understood now that he had been very wrong about what was relevant. The debrief after the ring assessment should have lasted an hour. It lasted 12 minutes because Kalok dismissed it early. He stood at the front of the debrief chamber with his tablet in his hand and his scales still a flat, pale gray, and ended the session in 2 sentences. Rees walked out beside Ilara. "He's scared," Rees said quietly, so the Drakari cadets ahead of them wouldn't hear. "Yes," Ilara said. "Of you. Of what I represent." She adjusted her pack strap. "There's a difference." Rees processed this for several paces. "What do you represent?" "A planet," she said, "full of us." They walked in silence for a moment through the corridor that smelled of recycled air and the mineral bite of the iron filters. Somewhere ahead, 2 Drakari cadets were discussing the ring assessment in low, careful voices that meant they were not sure what had happened, but were sure it mattered. "A Terran can voluntarily suppress the nervous panic response," Rees said. He was reading from his tablet, a xenobiological file he had pulled up, running through it quickly, completely. It reads as biological stillness to most sensor arrays. He looked over at her. "You did this in the labyrinth. You did something like it in the ring." "The panic response is noise," Ilara said. "It costs energy, it broadcasts position. Sol 3 didn't select for panic, it selected for quiet." "Your evolutionary history," Rees said, "is profoundly unsettling." "We find it pretty normal," she said. Rees turned his tablet off. He seemed to be doing this to avoid reading more things that would require him to update his probability estimates on his own safety. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Kalok is going to do something else. He is not a creature who accepts revised data quietly. He will want to run another variable." Ilara nodded. "What variable is left?" Rees asked. She didn't answer immediately. They had reached the corridor junction where their bunk assignments split, Rees to the Oculan section, Ilara to the small annex that had been retrofitted for the 2 Terran cadets in the cohort, because nobody had thought to build human quarters into the original Spire design. She stopped at the junction. "Whatever he thinks will re-establish the model he had before this morning," she said. The lights in the Oculan corridor flickered once. It was a power fluctuation, minor, the kind the Spire's older sections got when the magnetic rail system ran its maintenance cycle. Both of them looked at the ceiling for a moment, then Rees looked back down at her. "Do you think he's already requested it?" he asked. The Spire-wide comm channel opened with a tone that cut through the corridor noise like a blade. "All cadets, priority assembly, Deck 7, briefing Suite C 15 minutes. The voice was Major Zahn's, not Kalok's. Rees's lenses cycled rapidly through several focal lengths in quick succession, which was the Oculan equivalent of blinking in surprise. "That is not Kalok's channel." "No," Ilara said. She was already moving toward Deck 7. Briefing Suite C smelled different from the rest of the Spire. Not ozone, not sterilized metal. Something older, the specific sharpness of emergency atmo scrubbers running on a higher cycle, the kind of smell that meant a room's air had been turned over fast because the people in it had been generating too much heat. People under stress smell different. Major Zahn had been in this room for a while before he called the assembly. He was standing at the tactical display when the cadets filed in. He was not Drakari, Zahn was Kethian, broader than a human but low to the ground, with a flat, wide head and the dense musculature of a species that had evolved for sustained load-bearing rather than speed. He wore active duty insignia on both shoulders, which meant this was not a training exercise. The display behind him showed an orbital refinery platform. The schematic was rotating slowly, automated, the way displays rotate when someone has loaded a file and then stopped looking at it because they already know what it says. 40 minutes ago, Zahn said, without preamble, a mercenary unit seized the Kethai's IV orbital refinery. 17 workers are confirmed inside. The mercenaries have shut down the platform's distress relay, which means this briefing is the first official notification of the situation. He tapped the display. The schematic stopped rotating. The Spire is the closest asset. We are the response. The room was quiet. "This is not a simulation," he said. "Top-ranking cadets from this cohort will join a 4-person breach team. You will enter through the primary airlock on the platform's ventral face. You will secure the hostages. You will neutralize the threat." He looked at the display. "You will have 10 minutes to gear up." Ilara was already looking at the schematic. The refinery's ventral airlock was a standard industrial design, single entry, narrow funnel, the kind of approach geometry that gave defenders a permanent structural advantage. Anyone coming through that door was coming through it one at a time into a field of fire from at least 3 angles. It was, tactically, a terrible door to come through. She was trying to remember if she'd ever come through a worse one. Kalok arrived at the briefing suite 2 minutes after Zahn's address ended. He stood in the doorway and watched the cadets receiving gear assignments, his optical ridges cycling through their calibration pattern, the thing they did when he was processing something he hadn't planned for. He pulled Zahn aside. Ilara didn't hear what he said, but she watched his hands. He held them at chest height, palms angled inward. In the briefing she'd received on Drakari body language before shipping out, that posture meant "I am claiming jurisdiction." Zahn's response was brief. He didn't change his posture at all. He pointed at the tactical display once, then turned back to the gear table. Kalok stayed in the doorway for a moment, then he stepped back into the corridor. Rees appeared at Ilara's left shoulder. "He wanted to pull you from the team," Rees said quietly. His lenses were aimed at the doorway. Zahn declined. How do you know? I read body language across 14 species, Rees said. It is the primary oculan survival skill. A pause. Also, I was watching very carefully. Ilara picked up her gear pack. Are you on the breach team? No sensor support from the spire's remote array. He watched her check the seal on her equipment. Ilara, she looked at him, the airlock approach on that schematic is a fatal funnel. You understand this? I know, she said. The mercenaries will have the angles covered. Anyone who comes through that door. Rees. He stopped. I know what a fatal funnel is, she said. I've come through them before. She sealed her pack. How many mercs does the spire's sensor array estimate? Rees checked his tablet. Between 6 and 9. The refinery's internal cameras have been looped, so the count is estimated from thermal mapping through the hull. 6 to 9. 4-person breach team, one of whom was Ilara, 2 of whom were Drakari cadets she had not trained with, and 1 of whom was a Kethian security officer whose primary combat rating she didn't know. She'd come through worse doors. Get me the thermal layout when you have it, she said. The transport to the orbital refinery took 30 minutes on a fast burn. Ilara spent 28 of them studying the schematic on a borrowed tablet, and the remaining 2 doing nothing, sitting with her back against the transport wall, eyes open, breathing at a rate that would have registered on a medical monitor as deep sleep. The Drakari cadets, a paired unit named Gorak and Veth, who had apparently trained together since their first year and communicated in the clipped shorthand of people who have rehearsed the same drills enough times that language has become optional, glanced at her twice during those 2 minutes and then looked away both times, which Ilara took as a reasonable response. The Kethian security officer, whose name was Prex, and who had the flat, efficient demeanor of someone who had done this kind of work before and found it mostly routine, had also noticed Ilara's breathing. He didn't look away. He just filed it and went back to checking his weapon. The transport docked at the refinery's ventral airlock with a sound like 2 surfaces that had never been designed to meet being forced into agreement. Stack order, Prex said. Gorak leads. Veth second, I'm third, Vance you're. Fourth is fine, Ilara said. Prex looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had expected an argument and was slightly unsettled by not getting one. Fourth clears the room after the main push. You'll be coming into active fire. I understand the stack order, she said. Prex nodded once slowly, then turned back to the airlock panel. Gorak and Veth exchanged a look. Ilara didn't see what was in it because she was watching the airlock seam, tracing the gap where the pressure differential would push the door when it opened, calculating the angle the smoke would take. The breach charge went into the seam. At the spire's remote sensor array, Rees was watching the thermal layout of the refinery's interior. 6 distinct heat signatures clustered near the central processing floor, 3 near the airlock corridor, positioned at the angles Ilara had looked at on the schematic, 3 more further back, near the hostage cluster. The breach team's signatures showed on a separate overlay, 4 shapes stacked at the ventral airlock. Rees was counting seconds without knowing he was doing it. Then the Vance signature did the thing he had watched it do twice before. It went quiet. Not gone, the thermal layer still showed her body heat, a pale outline against the airlock wall, but the biometric layer dropped to nothing. No pulse, no respiratory motion, no autonomic signal. The shape of her was there, and the proof of her life was not, and Rees had now seen this enough times to know what it meant. She was getting ready. He said to the empty sensor room, "Please don't get killed." He was not speaking to the Drakari. The charge blew. Gorak went first, which was the plan, his plate armor absorbing the initial burst of light and pressure that came through the open door. Veth was a step behind. Prex was a step behind Veth. Ilara came through last. By the time she was through the door, the geometry had already changed. Gorak had pulled left to draw fire, the Drakari instinct put the armor between the threat and the softer things, and the three entrenched mercenaries at the corridor angles had oriented on him. Two of their weapons were tracking Gorak. One was tracking the doorway. The one tracking the doorway was the problem. It was not tracking Ilara, because by the time the mercenary's sensor sight finished sweeping the doorway, she had already stepped off the breach line and was moving along the corridor's right wall at an angle that put her outside the weapon's natural sweep range. She was not running. She was moving the way water moves, finding the path that exists rather than forcing one. The first mercenary was at the corridor's far angle, weapon braced on a support strut, focused on Gorak. Ilara came up behind him from the right side, which was the side his weapon was not on, and took him out of the engagement in one motion that used the strut he was bracing against as the fulcrum. She was already moving to the second before he finished falling. The second was faster. He caught the motion in his peripheral vision and started to turn. She was under his weapon arm before the turn completed. The weapon discharged once into the ceiling. Then he was no longer a variable. The third had Prex in his sights and was a half-second from pulling through when Ilara put him down from behind with the clean efficiency of someone who had calculated the angle 3 steps ago and was only now arriving at the conclusion. She had not broken her forward momentum at any point. She was already past the first corridor junction, moving toward the central processing floor where the remaining 3 mercenaries were, when Prex's voice came through the comm channel. Vance, status. She checked her weapon, corridor clear, moving to secondary. A pause. How many did you? 3, she said. Stay with Gorak and Veth. I'll call when I need you. She didn't wait for a response. The central processing floor was a wide, low-ceilinged space that smelled of coolant and metal shavings, filled with the large cylindrical forms of the refinery's core processing units. The hostages, 17 of them, were secured along the far wall in groups, wrists bound with cargo restraints. The 3 remaining mercenaries were distributed across the processing floor in a triangle formation that had clearly been set with the airlock assault in mind. They were watching the wrong door. Ilara came in through the maintenance access panel in the east wall, which she had located on the schematic, because maintenance access panels on orbital refineries of this class were always on the east wall because they needed to be reachable by service drones coming off the solar-facing side, and service drones always docked on the solar-facing side, and the solar-facing side of this refinery was east. The first mercenary didn't know she was there until she was already past him. She took the second and third in the time it took Prex and the Drakari to breach the main floor door, which meant that by the time they came through it, the room was quiet. Prex stopped in the doorway. He looked at the 3 mercenaries. He looked at Ilara, who was moving along the hostage line checking restraints. He looked at his own weapon. You came through the maintenance access, he said. Yes, she said. That panel is 40 centimeters wide. I know. Prex's mouth closed. He holstered his weapon slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who has decided to think about what they are feeling later when there is time. He moved to help with the hostages. Gorak and Veth stood at the door, plates shifting in the slow tide rhythm of a Drakari processing something. Gorak said something to Veth in their clipped shorthand. Veth said nothing back. Ilara was cutting the last set of restraints when she noticed her own hands. Steady, not from discipline, she hadn't needed to discipline them. They were simply steady, the way they always were after, because nothing in her body had interpreted what just happened as an event that warranted unsteadiness. She thought, briefly, about what Rees had said. Your evolutionary history is profoundly unsettling. She set the cutter down on the processing unit beside her. She breathed. Outside the refinery, through the hull plates, the planet Kethai's IV turned in the dark. Under it, in the Spire's sensor room, a nervous Oculan was watching a biometric readout come back online, pulse returning, steady, calm, and saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. At the Spire, Kalok was already reading Prex's preliminary incident report. He read the corridor section twice. then the processing floor section. Then he set the report down on his console and looked at the orbital display showing the refinery's position, a small bright dot above the curve of Kethai's IV, for a long time without moving. His aide, Thesis, had learned, in the time since the ring assessment, that there were silences from the proctor that required a response and silences that did not. This was one that did not. She stayed at her station and said nothing. After a long moment, Kalok said, "Pull the Terran fleet integration files." Thesis looked up. "So?" "The full files, not the cadet intake summary, the military integration assessment, how many Terran units are cleared for active deployment." He paused. "How many are in this sector?" Thesis began pulling the files. The numbers that came back were not small. The files loaded in columns on Kalok's console, unit counts, deployment readiness ratings, sector assignments, response time estimates. Thesis had pulled everything the Spire's clearance level could access, which was substantial, because the Vanguard Spire was a military installation, and military installations needed to know what assets were in range. There were a great many Terran assets in range. Not cadets, not integration cohorts, full units, deep void infantry divisions, breach specialists, long-range interdiction teams. The categories kept coming, each one annotated with capability ratings that Kalok had never needed to cross-reference against a species he had considered, until this morning, to be a minor footnote in the galactic military order. He read for a long time without speaking. Thesis watched the columns load and said nothing. She had, in the past several hours, developed the strong instinct that the appropriate response to most things was silence and careful observation. Kalok closed the files. He sat with his hands flat on the console surface, which was something Thesis had never seen him do. Kalok was a creature of constant motion, constant calibration, the sort of authority figure whose stillness meant something had stopped working. He stared at the orbital display where the refinery was still showing as a bright dot above Kethai's IV. "The Terran," he said finally, not to Thesis, not to the room, in the tone of someone working through an equation. She entered the labyrinth and her biometrics dropped to nothing. She climbed an armored Drakari's back and waited for him to run out of air. She came through a fatal funnel forth and cleared the corridor before the breach team finished stacking. He paused, and her hands were steady afterward. Thesis said nothing. She was not performing, Kalok said. She was not suppressing. Her body did not register those events as emergencies. He looked at the fleet files on the screen beside the display. None of them do. That's what the field reports say. They operate in conditions that would produce biochemical crisis in any other species, and their physiology simply does not. He turned away from the console. "How many more are there?" he said. It was not a question in the way questions usually are. It was the thing you say when the answer is already visible and you are not sure you want to say it aloud. Thesis looked at the numbers on her screen. "Many," she said. The transport back to the Spire was quieter than the trip out. Gorak had a scored plate on his left shoulder where a mercenary round had caught him at an oblique angle, not a breach, not even close to a breach, but a mark, which for a Drakari meant something. He kept touching it with 2 fingers, not checking it, just acknowledging it. Veth sat beside him and said nothing in the particular way that meant everything was being said. Prex sat across from them and wrote his incident report on a small tablet, the old-fashioned way, in long lines of precise notation. He wrote for several minutes without looking up. Then he stopped. He looked at Ilara, who was sitting with her back against the transport wall with her eyes open, not sleeping, not reading, not doing anything that had a name. "Vance," he said. She looked at him. "The maintenance panel," he said. "You had 11 seconds between the corridor clear and the processing floor breach. You located the panel, assessed whether it could be entered, and entered it. In 11 seconds. He looked at his report. "I'm going to write that you used the panel. I don't know how to write the rest of it in a way that reads accurately." Ilara said, "Write that you breached the main floor door and found the room clear." Prex looked at her for a moment. "That's not what happened." It's what you need in the report, she said. Another moment, Prex turned back to his tablet and wrote one line. He did not show her what it said. Gorak, from across the transport, said something in Drakari that Alara's translator rendered as, "She threads where there is no thread." It might have been an idiom. She didn't ask. The Spire's landing bay smelled of exhaust and the metallic cold of open space recently sealed out. The breach team walked the ramp down in the particular silence of people who have been in a situation together and have not yet decided what they think about it. Rees was waiting at the bay threshold. He looked at all four of them in the systematic way his species assessed returning parties, checking for injury markers, asymmetry of movement, signs of shock. He completed the assessment in about 3 seconds. Then he looked at Ilara. "You're uninjured," he said. "Yes," she said. "Your biometrics were completely suppressed for the first 40 seconds inside the refinery." "I know." He fell into step beside her. His tablet was under his arm. He was quiet for a moment, which for an Oculan meant he was running through several things he wanted to say and selecting one. "Before the breach charge blew," he said, "I watched your readout. You were doing the thing you did in the labyrinth, dropping everything." He paused. "You were the last one through the door." "Yes." "You did that deliberately. You let 3 armored team members go first, then you went through into whatever fire remained." "Fourth clears the room," she said. "Standard stack." Rees processed this. "You were the most capable combatant on that team." "Yes." "And you placed yourself at the highest exposure point." "The stack order was set," Ilara said. "I took the position I was assigned." She glanced at him. "The 4th position is highest exposure. That's why it's usually filled by the least experienced member. Prex didn't know what I could do yet." "But you knew." She considered this. "I knew I could handle it." Rees was quiet for another few steps. Then, on Sol 3, when your species hunted, the most capable hunter took the most dangerous angle, Ilara said, so the others didn't have to. Rees stopped walking. Ilara kept going for 3 more paces, then stopped and turned back. He was standing in the corridor with his tablet pressed against his chest and all 6 of his lenses focused on her at once, which was the Oculan expression you produced when you were trying to see something whole. "We do not possess armor, Proctor," she said, and it took Rees a moment to realize she was quoting something she'd said earlier, not to him, but as if testing the weight of the words in her mouth. "We adapt until we do not need it." She turned and kept walking. Kalok was in the corridor outside the debrief room when she passed it. He was not waiting. That was clear from the way he stood, not positioned, not ready, simply present, a large creature occupying a space without quite knowing what to do with it. His scales had come back to something close to their normal coloration, the cobalt returning in uneven patches, the gray still showing at his jaw ridges. Ilara stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. His optical ridges were still, no calibration cycle, no tracking, just looking. He reached up and unclipped the ceremonial disruption baton from his side. He held it for a moment, a short silver rod, the kind of object that meant authority in the spire the way a key means authority in a locked room. He had carried it since his first year as proctor and had never once needed to use it on a student. He set it on the corridor rail beside him. He didn't explain the gesture. He didn't offer it to her. He just set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone putting a thing somewhere it will stay, and looked at her. "How many of you are there?" he said. Ilara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the baton on the rail. It was a good piece of equipment, weighted correctly, well maintained, the kind of object someone had taken care of for a long time. "Enough," she said. She walked past him. Behind her she heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Kalok standing in the corridor with his baton on the rail and the fleet integration files he had read an hour ago sitting in his memory like something that could not be unread. The combat registry updated that evening. Rees saw it first because he was monitoring the spire's assessment feeds. He had been doing this continuously since the labyrinth trial, which he recognized was not a psychologically neutral behavior, but which he had decided to continue anyway. The update posted at the standard hour, automated, pulled from the day's recorded assessments. Ilara Vance, all categories, first position. Below her name, in the notes field where Kaylock usually entered brief commendations or technical observations, there was a single line. Rees read it, he read it again. He saved the readout to his personal files without showing it to anyone. The note said, "Recommend immediate reclassification, threat category, not cadet category." Ilara was in the small retrofitted annex that served as human quarters when Rees found her. She was sitting at the narrow desk with nothing on it, doing nothing that had a name, the same way she had sat in the transport. The room had a viewport, a small one, an afterthought, and through it, Kethai's IV turned slowly in the dark, its cloud cover lit from below by the city lights on its dayside face. She had her back to the viewport. Rees stood in the doorway and looked at her hands, flat on the desk, completely still. Kaylock filed a reclassification request, he said. She didn't react to this. What category? Threat. A pause, not wrong, she said. Rees came in and sat on the edge of the small cot that occupied the room's far wall. He put his tablet on his knees. He looked at the viewport, at the planet turning behind her. The other Terran cadet in the cohort, he said. Davan, he is in cohort B, different rotation. I pulled his assessment profile this afternoon. He paused. His numbers are comparable to yours. Ilara looked at him. The Spire has 4 Terran cadets in active rotation, Rees said. Across the 4 nearest academies in this sector, there are another 31. He looked at his tablet. And those are only the cadets. The integration files Kaylock pulled tonight. I have access to the same clearance level through my sensor array credentials. He set the tablet face down on his knees. The unit's already cleared for active deployment in this sector alone. Rees, she said. He stopped. I know, she said. Through the viewport, Kethai's IV kept turning. The planet had no idea what had been decided about it in a briefing suite 40 minutes after the mercenaries hit the refinery. It had no idea what was being decided right now in a small retrofitted room by 2 cadets who had met 4 days ago. Planets rarely did. Ilara looked at her hands on the desk. She thought about the hunting, the long running down, the patience bred into something over enough generations that it stopped being patience and became structure. The way her body had moved through the corridor, not choosing to be quiet, not disciplining herself into stillness, just operating at the register it had always operated at, the one that said the prey is not dead yet, keep moving, keep quiet, do not stop until it is done. She had not been afraid in the refinery. She had not been afraid in the ring. She had not been afraid, standing at the assembly hall entrance with 31 armored cadets looking at her, because fear was noise, and Sol 3 had spent a very long time learning to be quiet. Even in the slaughter's wake, her heart refused to race. She lifted her hands off the desk and folded them together once and set them back down. The motion was nothing, a small adjustment, the kind of thing a person does when they have finished thinking about something and are ready to move to the next thing. Get some sleep, she said to Rees. The second rotation starts early. Rees picked up his tablet. He stood. He stood in the doorway for a moment, all 6 lenses aimed at the viewport and the planet turning behind her. They had no idea, he said quietly, not to her, to the room. Ilara said nothing. He left. She sat at the desk in the small room with the wrong-sized ceiling and the viewport that looked out at a planet that did not know it was being reassessed. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. Her pulse ran at the low, unhurried rate of something that had evolved in a place where hurrying drew attention. In the Spire's main corridor, Kaylock's disruption baton sat on the rail where he had left it. No one had moved it. Down the hall, in the registry system, her name sat at the top of every column. Outside, the dark held many stars, and under some of them, in ships and stations and bases that the Vanguard spire had never thought to count. The rest of humanity waited, patient, quiet, unhurried, for whatever came next.